Welcome back. It's Erick Erickson here across the nation. It is Good Friday, and avoiding politics as usual this Good Friday, I am joined by Dr. Guy Richard. He is the president and an associate professor of systematic theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Atlanta, where at some point I'm going to get back to classes. And he's also, this will make many of you happy, an Auburn grad. So there you go. My 15-year-old Auburn apparently has an excellent architectural school, and he is starting to wonder if he should go to Auburn for architecture if he can bring up his math grade.
Well, it is a good school. It's a good school on a variety of fronts. I was an engineering graduate myself, so I was not part of the architecture school, but they do have a good reputation there as well. Eric, thank you for having me today. It's a delight to be with you.
I'm so glad you could do this. Now, I got to pivot real quick here because this is one of the things that's always impressed me taking classes at RTS in Atlanta is the caliber of faculty who came into ministry in somewhat non-traditional routes, I guess I should say. And so you've went the engineering route at Auburn, and yet here you are, the president of RTS in Atlanta.
Yeah, I was kind of a late bloomer, I guess you'd say. I did engineering work for a number of years after graduating with a degree in industrial engineering. I went to work for Westinghouse, who's actually no longer in business. They ended up selling off all of their business units to different companies. I think Eaton Corporation ended up buying the business unit that I worked with, but I worked with them for a number of years, and the Lord kind of used just my experience in business and experience in a family business to lead me to ministry, into a call to ministry, and then to seminary and on to do my PhD. So it was, I think the background as an engineer certainly has given me a unique perspective on the Bible and the study of theology in general.
So we're both being from Louisiana, and you were the minister at First Pres in Gulfport, and you dealt with the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And our friend Sheldon sent me your book, Persistent Prayer, and I got to imagine the role of prayer when that storm came through, and just the disaster in its wake. I know so many people who they don't even live where they used to live anymore because Katrina wiped them out. How was that? Can you just talk about that as a minister and how events like that, natural disasters, really impact people?
Yeah, there's no doubt. The church in Gulfport called me to be their pastor in May of 2005. I was going to start in October. We were actually living in Edinburgh, Scotland at the time. I was finishing up my PhD, and the church called me, and obviously we know Hurricane Katrina came August 29th, so before I even showed up on the ground. And we lost about a third of the members in the church. About 60 families lost everything. And it was an incredibly difficult time. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of what I learned about prayer came in the crucible. It came in the midst of trying to figure out, what do we do? Where do we go? After Hurricane Katrina, we had a hard time even finding food and water. And in terms of figuring out, what do we do? How do we help 60 families get back into homes? And then you look around South Mississippi, and that was the story everywhere. 150,000 homes, I think it was, were destroyed on the Mississippi Gulf Coast alone, not to mention what happened in New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina. So it was an absolutely devastating time where we knew we didn't have what it took in terms of expertise and wisdom and know-how. We needed to rely on the Lord, and so we prayed, and we saw the Lord answer prayer in some amazingly visible ways.
I encounter so many people right now, particularly people after COVID, so disconnected and isolated, and wondering, is it worth still praying? Prayers not being answered. They don't know that God is listening to them anymore. They're growing frustrated. How do you minister to people going through that season in life?
Well, there are a variety of seasons, and especially, I think, as you say, the difficult seasons of life that make our prayers especially meaningful, especially it's at those times that I think we look and we wrestle with whether or not God is there, whether or not God is listening. And I think we need to remember that in the middle of these difficult times, the Bible teaches us that God answers all of our prayers. He may not answer them in the way that we pray them. He may not answer them in the way that we want them to be answered. But he's answering our prayers, and he's answering them for our good. And in terms of what we need most in the time, and that usually means in terms of what God is looking at, a spiritual perspective. Spiritual growth is what God is really after. He's after our hearts. He's after what's best for us spiritually, and what's best for us, what we think what's best for us physically may or may not be a part of what's best for us spiritually.
My pastor, who I know, Chip Miller, he did I thought a great sermon a few weeks ago on prayer, that so many people pray as if God just will throw things at them. He's their sugar daddy, so to speak. He didn't use that word, but I want the winning lottery ticket. I want the big house, and I know that there's you're prone sometimes to do that. I'm prone to do things like that, and just being recalibrated that he's going to answer your prayer, but he's going to answer it in a way that glorifies him and advances your walk with him, as opposed to throwing the winning lottery ticket at you that might actually lead to your own destruction.
That's exactly right. I mean, God is more concerned about our joy, long-term speaking, and that means bringing eternity into account. He's more concerned about our joy than he is about our temporary happiness. And so I think that's exactly the way we'd want it to be. If we knew, if we believed that this world is not our home, that this world is not the end-all and the be-all of our existence, that our existence is going to go on for eternity beyond our time on earth, then we would want God to be about our best interest eternally and not just temporarily, because this time is fleeting and this time will come to an end. And if eternity goes on and on and on, then a good God can love us best by taking that eternal perspective.
Okay, so you did something there, and I want to see if you can speak a little more to it. The distinction that I think gets lost in modern contemporary consumerist society between happiness and joy, that so many people make them the same thing, and they're really not.
That's correct. That's right. Yeah, happiness is definitely about, I think, based on here and now. Happiness is not necessarily connected to, happiness is usually connected to our circumstances, isn't it? And joy is circumstance independent, or at least it ought to be, because we can be joyful even when we're unhappy. And we can be joyful when our circumstances are not making us happy. That joy is grounded in something that's deeper than circumstantial.
That's such a good distinction. I think people forget. So I only got a couple more minutes with you, but to the heart of it, we're on Good Friday. Easter's coming. What does Easter mean to you personally?
Yeah, Easter means hope. It means that there's hope. You know, one of the best distinctions that I love in the Bible centers on the word hope. We so often use the word hope to mean an uncertain desire. It's something we want to happen, but we really have no idea as to whether or not it's going to. As you mentioned, I'm an Auburn graduate, and I love Auburn. We were in the NC2A tournament for basketball just recently. We lost in the first round to Yale, and so if you had asked me Friday afternoon, I would say I hope Auburn wins tonight, but obviously we did not, and so that would have been a very uncertain desire. But I think that's the way we use hope. We use it as something that's uncertain. We don't think it's going to happen. But we'd like it to happen. But the Bible never uses hope that way. The Bible uses it in terms of a confident expectation, because that hope is grounded in the Lord. And I think the resurrection gives us that confidence. And for me, that's the single biggest thing the resurrection does, is it gives me hope that death is not the end. It's not the last word, that everything God has said in his word will come to pass.
I'm glad you said that because I know you didn't know this, and I should preface it with this way that a couple of years ago, Tim Keller, after his pancreatic cancer diagnosis, participated in this with me and spent a lot of time on how he thinks hope is better interpreted as the profound certainty and that he knew what
That's
his
right.
diagnosis was and where it would lead, but he had profound certainty in the resurrection, and so he knew at the end of the day that he would be okay. It's just it's the modern vocabulary and modifications of language, I think, really loses something in translation when we forget about that profound certainty.
Well, and we live in such an uncertain day, an uncertain age, and to have something that gives us certainty, like the resurrection, takes on a new significance, I think, in our practical everyday experience.
I think so. That's well said. Well, see, this doesn't last long, but I sure am glad I had a few minutes with you, Guy. Those of you just tuning in, I'm talking to Guy Richard, the president of the Reformed Theological Seminary in Atlanta, and I'm glad you were able to do this with me.
Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate you, appreciate what you do, and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Let me tell you about Vision Computer. If you are a small business, big business, and you need IT support, you don't necessarily can't afford someone in-house, or you've got an in-house guy and he's overwhelmed right now. Well, Vision Computer, for $179 a year, not a month, they can supplement your IT or be your IT. You don't even have to have bought your computers from Vision Computers to take advantage of this. And your employees will get a phone number, and 15 seconds or less, they can get an answer to what's going on. Email, printer support, they can help you with everything about your computers. They can remote in, they can do patches, whatever you need. So your employees can be your best employees focused on their jobs, not on their computers. They can also build computers for you. If you're in the market for a computer for your home or your office, Vision Computers can do it for you. All you do is go to visioncomputers.com or 404-COMPUTE. Visioncomputers.com or 404-COMPUTE. If you let Vision Computers build your computers for you, you're going to get Vision's world-class support. They've got thousands of 5-star Google reviews. They know how to help small businesses thrive. Your employees can be the best at their job, and Vision is best in class for their computer service. Your son or daughter headed off to college, let Vision build their computer for them. And when they get to college, they won't have to worry about their computer issues. They can call Vision and Vision will take care of them. So they can be really good at studying and they don't have to be experts at fixing their computers. Visioncomputers.com or 404-COMPUTE. If you tell Vision I sent you, you get an even better deal. Visioncomputers.com or 404-COMPUTE. Hello there, it is Erick Erickson here, and in a total brain fart moment, I did the Vision Computers ad in the last segment, and I should have done it in this segment. Oh, well, that's okay. So, oh boy, welcome. Yep, it is. It's also one of those days. In any event, I want to thank Guy Richard, and I really am. I'm going to get back to seminary. If y'all haven't heard that story, though, I mentioned it briefly earlier. So I was, I started, I didn't intend to talk about theology. I mean, the two things you're not supposed to talk about, religion and politics, and here I talk about both. But I did, and it was cultural stuff, really. But I was tying the cultural stuff into essentially it became my worldview is I mean, Christian centric, for lack of a better phrase. And so I was trying to explain the rise of transgenderism and stuff several years ago on the radio, and it started talking about it, and then I did the Good Friday show, and one thing led to another, to some churches calling and asking if I would fill in for them. And it was really awkward to me that I was being asked to fill in for preachers on Sunday because I had no theological training at all. And after probably 2 years of this, I finally said, okay, I'll do it, and decided to enroll in Reformed Theological Seminary. And actually went, John Soul, and God bless you, John, I miss you if you're listening to this. You usually listen to my Good Friday show. But so John Soul was the president at the time before Guy Richard. John Soul was the president of RTS in Marietta, and he took me to lunch. He said, listen, we're happy you're coming to RTS, but I need you to promise something to me. I said, okay, what? He said, well, you make the promise, and then I'll tell you what you're promising. Oh, okay. So I said, all right, whatever it is, I promise. He says, good, don't come to seminary. It's like, oh, how does this work? He says, listen, you come take every class you want to take. And if you get a degree, you get a degree. But don't come with the mindset that you're going to seminary, because you're going to start sounding like that on radio and people don't want to hear that. And I sometimes do follow that track. And I realize it. This show in particular, this day, I realize it. But it was great advice. It actually put my boss, the pig farmer at the time, at ease that he would give me that advice. And I've loved going, and I've just been taking classes. Took the systematics and apologetics and the gospels and the prophets, and I got more to take working on my degree. And I've had to sit out because life has been so insane these past couple of years. For a while, I was doing 6 hours of radio. But anyway, so then these people, they hear that, okay, I've been in seminary. I feel competent to preach it. They start calling back. And when they find out I'm going to Reformed Seminary, they're like, so these are free will guys. I'm a Calvinist, believe in predestination, all that. They're like, nope, thank you. Sorry. Literally had one church. I kid you not. They invited me to preach, knew I was in seminary. When I mentioned it, they called back, said the pastor wanted to know when you were, where you're going to seminary. And I told them, and she says, okay, I'll pass it on. Called me back the next day. She says, hey, we realized we got a mistake. It's the pastor's birthday that weekend, and we can't have you preaching during the pastor's birthday. We're doing something special for him. We'll call you back and get it scheduled. That was, I think, 7 or 8 years ago. They haven't called back yet. So the very first time, y'all, seriously, the very first time I was ever asked to preach was at an event in Colorado. It was kind of fun. They asked the theology guys to talk politics, the politics guys to talk theology, and so I was given the Sunday sermon. And who should sit down in front of me? As I was beginning to preach, I saw this white hair, and I looked down, and it was John MacArthur. If you know, you know. And my 30 minutes turned into about 8 minutes. I got off that stage as fast as I could. There is no way. I even had a MacArthur study Bible with me there. And yeah, there was no way I was standing on that stage preaching in front of John MacArthur for my very first time. Probably a little bit of arrogance on my part to think I could to begin with, but there was no way with that. But anyway, he is friends with my favorite professor from seminary and wound up texting him. And he says, your boy did good, but tell him to slow down. So in any event, that was my entree into preaching. I rarely get to do it, and I totally understand too, by the way. I totally get it. You don't want the guy who talks politics on the radio being the guy in the pulpit on Sunday because it can be very divisive. In the same way, I don't particularly like pastors getting super political. I understand people don't want the political guy coming into the church, but I've done it. I actually find it more challenging. I can literally do this show with little show prep if I need to. And I can riff on stuff. I have apparently it is one of my spiritual gifts, not in the Bible, but I can talk without shutting up. It's a challenge to preach, and that's why I enjoy it. Welcome back. It's the Good Friday Show nationwide. It's Erick Erickson here, and I've got joining me from the Land Center at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a professor at Texas Baptist College, my friend Dan Darling, where all of my friends in like the Baptist circles, y'all all wind up in Texas, all you ERLC guys.
Yeah, as I've told some of my former ERLC colleagues, all your exes live in Texas. Yeah, so yeah, we like it here. And,
so you got what? Philip is there. You're there.
Yes.
Dan is there, and of course they're preaching together. I need to go to that church at some point.
Yeah, it's great. We love it here. My wife's from Fort Worth, so she's, as I tell people, she's back in the Republic of Texas after 25 years in exile.
Nice. Good. Now, Dan, by the way, folks, in addition to being a friend, is also a much more prolific author than me, and you've written a series of books, The Characters of Christmas, Characters of Creation, The Characters of Easter, which I'm fascinated by because, in seminary, it didn't even really dawn on me. And people always ask those questions about the bracketing at the end of Mark, for example. What's this extra stuff? And my seminary professor trying to explain that, maybe after Matthew was written, Peter went back, added a little more to the narrative, and it otherwise would have ended with the women went away and said nothing to anyone. And so the first witnesses to the resurrection are these women who were not considered credible, and the first witnesses to the birth are the shepherds who were not considered credible, all these not considered credible people.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, I think there's two things we learned from that. One, that Jesus, that God in his plan chose the least of these to kind of be his witnesses to announce these things. Like we would have announced something like this with press releases and, with major media and TV and all that. Jesus decided to use shepherds at his birth to announce the coming of of Christ. And then, of course, the resurrection. It wasn't the disciples. It wasn't anybody else but the women who were the first ones, who were the first witnesses, and really the first evangelists. And I think it does say something about Christianity. First, I think it attests to the fact that the resurrection is true, because they would not have put forward the testimony of women in the first century. They're trying to, pull the wool over someone's eyes, number one. And number two, I think despite what you hear in the media and whatever, Christianity actually elevates women. Every culture that Christianity has gone into has elevated women. The fact that Jesus had female followers really says something about what makes it different.
Yeah, it is funny, the hysteria today of so many people on the misogynism or whatever of Christians, and the obsession with this small group of so-called Christian nationalists that we all apparently are, and there's such a depth of faith and so much in the story of Christ that just gets lost in the modern conversation. And as well, so much anxiety, and I guess you read the stories of the ordinary people who connect with Jesus, and I don't know, it almost seems to me like in a lot of the church today, there's this, and it's not even the churches, it's the people who are whipped into some sort of existential frenzy right now that they need to do something, that God can't do it themselves. And one of the remarkable things about the story is how Jesus elevates such lowly people and yet takes care of things himself.
That's right. And I think, this Easter is such a hinge point of our faith. And this is why we celebrate every year. And what we're saying to the world is, if this is really true, and we believe it is true that Jesus rose from the dead bodily, if this is really true, it changes everything. It means that the world, for all its brokenness and death and terribleness, this is not how it will always be. There's a better world coming, and that Christ has promised to raise his people, body and soul, at the end of the age. If he rose again, we too will rise. I mean, Paul said this in 1 Corinthians 15, that the resurrection is everything. And if it's not true, then we're of all men most miserable. And I think it's a message that the world really needs to hear and longs for. That how are we going to fix this? How are we going to get out of this mess? And believing in the resurrection, believing in Easter, I actually think, really believing, actually tempers our politics in the sense that we can go into the world, we can do some good, but we understand that we're limited, but that there's a better world coming, and one day Jesus is going to restore and renew the world.
Yeah, so I'm glad you said it that way, because I just more and more get this sense that people are kind of hanging on to it. I call it idol worship to a degree, and I try to be careful with that. But this view of the past, C.S. Lewis in Screwtape Letters writes about one of the advices to Wormwood is to keep people grounded in the past so they're never happy about the present. And I just seem like I see that so much in the world today, even among believers who forget there's actually this great thing coming, and it's the plan's already set, the battle's already won, so you can be happy and not live in this existential state of worry all the time.
Yeah, it's like Jesus said to his disciples in the upper room. I mean, he's telling them, your worst nightmare is going to happen. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be killed. They persecuted me. They're going to persecute you. And yet he says, be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. And, we can be people as Christians who do see the things wrong in the world. We rightly are concerned about things in our culture and our country. That's not unfounded. There's not unfounded fears. And yet we can also be people who understand that God has made us for this moment, that he is, we can be of good cheer because he has overcome the world. And we are resurrection people. We really honestly believe this. And Eric, there's times in my life, I lost my mom last year. You look around and see the death and brokenness and destruction and violence in the world. And really the only thing that can get you through it is to say, I actually really believe this resurrection. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe he defeated sin and death in the grave, and he's coming again. And what a great promise that is.
Yeah, it just, I mean, I get people all the time who ask me with my wife's cancer, just how can you believe in a God who gave her cancer? It's like, I don't believe he gave her cancer. I think we live in a fallen world and disease comes from that. But he lived this life completely pure and innocent and not guilty, and yet took on all the sins of the world and died and rose again. And we don't get a way out of it, but he chose not to take a way out of it either.
That's right. And I think one of the things we can cling to that. You've seen that with your health issues and your wife's health issues, that our bodies fail us, or the world is decaying. There's a lot of things that we can lament. There's suffering and angst around the world, but Christ has promised to make all things new. He has renewed and restored the world. He's not left us like this. And one of the things I say on Easter is to people who are not believers is to say, you may not believe this yet, but if you really understand the story of Easter and the story that it's telling, you'll wish it was true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we do need someone outside of us to save us. We need something. I think this is one of the reasons people actually get involved in politics, Eric, is there is a sense that the world is not as it should be, and it should be better. People get involved, but when you understand the Christian story, you can do it in a way that's redemptive, and you can approach the world and say, Christ is returning. Not to say that we're pie in the sky and there's no problems. There actually are real problems. Christianity faces problems as they are, but we know that we can't solve them ourselves.
If you're just tuning in, I'm talking to my friend Dan Darling, author of the book Characters of Easter. So now let's take Jesus out of it, because that'd be the easy fallback.
Right.
Of all the characters in the story related to Easter, do you have one that you just kind of like, this is the one I'm most interested in?
Well, it's hard to pick one character because, picking your favorite child.
Right.
But I am partial, I think, to Peter, and I spend the most time on Peter in this book because there's so much about Peter in the Gospels. And just to see his journey from really a young, precocious young man who left everything behind, his fishing business, to become the bold, apostle that we see in the book of Acts that's willing to face death in jail to preach the gospel. And, I think we sometimes judge Peter because he'll say things he shouldn't or whatever, pulls out his sword. But we forget, he left everything to follow Jesus. It was very uncertain. And he said the things that everyone was thinking. But it's also Peter who said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." He's the one who would stand by Peter. And one of the things I think is helpful is he's a lot like us. I mean, here Peter says, and I think it's funny, he pulls Jesus aside and he says, all these turkeys are going to leave you and abandon you, but not me. I'm going to stick with you. I'm tougher than these guys. And Jesus says, no, you're not as tough as you think you are. You actually are weaker than you think. And so Peter's instinct to want to stand up for Jesus was right, but he wanted to do it in his own strength. And of course, he didn't have that strength. But then we see after the resurrection, Jesus restores him to his original calling. And we see him boldly proclaim the gospel in the book of Acts. He even was martyred for his faith. And he did that because he was empowered by the Holy Spirit. And I just love his story. Of how Jesus patiently called him and discipled him.
Yeah, and for people who are listening to us, we know his story. We know he was a real person. I'm just always marvel at the amount of people you have to write out of history to say the story isn't real.
That's right. And really, if you look at the circumstantial evidence for the reresurrection, it's hard to resist. I mean, as C.S. Lewis said, Jesus either a liar or a lunatic or the Lord. N.T. Wright has written a great book. It's an 800-pound or page doorstopper, but it's maybe the most comprehensive look at the resurrection, the proofs of it, and it's hard to deny. I mean, if you look at it with an objective eye.
Yeah, and it just I always start my show, as I did this year, that. Even among secular historians, when you ask them the top important events in history, maybe not the resurrection, but the execution of a carpenter in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago generally ranks as number 1 or 2.
That's right. And, it's a hinge point of history. And, I think Tim Keller used to say this, and others have said it, and even the historian Tom Holland has made the case. A lot of the ways that even Christianity is judged by the world are from values that actually originate in Christianity. A lot of the things even modern Western society says they believe, like justice and all this, the caring for the poor, those things started and originated with Christianity. And Christianity had such a profound influence that even the way it's often judged are judged by values that came from Christianity itself,
So true. All right, I got to leave it there. I could keep talking, but Dan, it's just a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on, and really love the work that you do, Eric.
Thank you so much.
I know you thought
Welcome back. It's Erick Erickson here across the nation. I'm delighted to have you with me this Good Friday. If you're not able to get to church, I guess you can consider this church for you today. Appreciate it. And thanks to Dan and Guy as well. Andrew Walker, A friend of mine comes up next, and we're going to talk about ethics and our political world today. But, Dan, so he mentions Peter in the book. One of the things I love is, so in seminary, my wife and I are in a Sunday school class, and there's this big conversation about, was everybody and everything vegetarian in the Garden of Eden? In my very first class in seminary, I jumped off the deep end into covenant theology, which was one of the harder classes with one of the harder professors, who is my favorite professor, Derek Thomas. Love the guy. He's from Wales. And the first day in class, he's talking about this idea from a theologian named Meredith Klein that everything and everybody in the garden were vegetarians. He's like, I couldn't worship a God that couldn't eat a steak. But then he points to Jesus in the resurrected body. He's grilling out fish for Peter. After, Peter's betrayed him and now he's restoring him. And he's like, look, this is the resurrected body. This is like what it would be like in the garden. Clearly not a vegetarian. He's grilling fish. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. One, I love this guy, and two, great point. But one of the points that he made, and then my Gospels professor made that I love so much, is that in John, so John is Jesus's best friend, and kind of writes in there snarkily towards the end that, in the race with Peter, John wins. But John always uses Peter and Judas together. In fact, if you read the Gospel of John, one of the things that'll open your eyes to it is that Peter and Judas are always juxtaposed to each other. And the point there is that John is writing to a largely Greek audience, and the Greek literature of the day tended to have two sides and moralizing tales, two people who appear to be equal. One rose and one fell, and the moral of the story is be like the one who rose, not the one who fell. And John has picked up this literary device in Greek literature to convey that look at Peter and look at Judas. These are similarly situated guys. Jesus picks their apostles. They're both given roles. And in the end, they both betray Jesus. Both of them betray Jesus. Judas with a kiss, Peter by denying him 3 times before the rooster crowed, and yet Peter feels remorse and cries, and Jesus restores him. And the moral of the story is be like Peter, not like Judas. Now, there is something I want to say here very clearly. In this wild age that we're in, anti-Semitism is on the rise. And I don't want you to interpret me spending this day on Good Friday as anything that has any hint of anti-Semitism in it. And I say that very deliberately because I'm seeing this online, this Candace Owens Christ is King stuff, and it really is anti-Semitism. She's weaponizing Jesus against Jews. And when you see this picture of Jesus' betrayal, it's everybody betraying him in the end. It is the rich, it is the poor, it is the Jew, it is the Roman, it's everybody betrayed him. And Christianity and sinners twisted this to blame Jews. They were God's first people. While you and I, if you're of European descent, were still living in caves, the Jews were bringing law down from a mountain and had a relationship with God. And I don't want you to hear anti-Semitism in this. The moral of the story is not that the Jews killed Jesus. And if you believe that, not only have you missed the point, you really need to repent. The moral of the story is that all of us are sinners and we've all fallen. And here is Judas and here is Peter, and Peter is overcome with grief for his betrayal of God and repents, and Judas goes off and kills himself after betraying Jesus. And you need to understand that you as a Christian are to love your neighbor, and right now, this isn't political, this is just fact. You should have the back of the Jewish people this time of year, and we're heading from Easter to Passover next month. And the level of anti-Semitism against Jews in this country and around the world is going to be off the chains. And so you should have the back of the Jewish people because they need it and they deserve it, and they're wonderful people.